everybody. Woo! Right. Welcome to Emerald City. Welcome to Friday. It's already busy out there. It's pretty amazing. And by the looks of this room, this is pretty awesome. I'm pretty thrilled about this. Welcome to the Modern Fantasy Evolution panel. My name is Shawn Speakman. I'm the moderator. I will try not to talk very much because you guys are all here to listen to them. I am the author of The Dark Thorn, editor of Unfettered, for those of you who know. I also am the webmaster for this guy sitting to my left, which is a dubious honor at best. 20 years, I've been trying to get out of it, and it just hasn't happened.
One day I'll release him, the pictures.
I'm just going to go down the line here real quick because I'm sure you guys have a lot of questions, and so the faster we wrap things up, the quicker you guys can ask your questions. So, Shannara author Terry Brooks. Todd Lockwood, author of The Summer Dragon, and fabulous painter, by the way. He's done all my covers. Django Wexler, author of Shadow Campaign. Author of The Fitz and Fool, Robin Hobb. And Patrick Rothfuss is on hand. No, Kevin Hearne, author of Iron Druid Chronicles. So to get this started, you kind of need a couple definitions here, I think, up front when it comes to fantasy. You guys know what fantasy is, right?
Woo!
Right, so we don't really need to get into that definition. I don't think that would be an 8-day-long discussion, probably. But when it comes to the word modern, though, that's kind of interesting because everybody kind of has a different idea of what modern fantasy means. So I figured I'd start with the guy on my left, since he, in my opinion, for me personally, kind of started modern fantasy. What does modern fantasy mean for you, and what would its influences be?
Well, modern fantasy for me is pretty much my life since I was born, which was in 1944. You're not,
Yeah.
you're not buying it, sorry. Okay, fine. I think it's kind of a fluid definition. I'm not sure you can pick a time to say that this is the beginning of modern fantasy. Anybody who's already dead in my life who was a fantasist back then, they're the old fantasists, of course. Since I may be one of the oldest ones left, it pretty much starts with me at this point. I think I really think it's fairly new. I started writing a Tolkien-esque fantasy in the 60s, and that's kind of passé now for most writers. We don't see a lot of it anymore, and everybody's looking for something new and different, so the other forms have taken its place, and I think most of that has happened in the last maybe 15 years. And not to say that anything that's not relevant before then, but I think what we're seeing with what I would classify as any form of modern fantasy, which now is much more diverse and spread out than it used to be. It isn't in narrow stream anymore. It covers a lot of regions. I can remember when I was told by my publisher, my editor actually, that you never, ever, ever mixed fantasy and science fiction. That was just a taboo.
Yes, you do.
And I said, why would this be? And it would be because he told me so.
Was that before or after Star Wars came out?
Yeah, well, there you go, right? It was before, but nevertheless.
And Django's work would totally disagree with that.
So, we know none of that. So those rules have gone by the boards a long time ago, and now we're getting all kinds of work that sprawls all over the place. And I think the modern fantasy form is the most stolen from form of writing in all of literature. Almost every other form of literature steals from us.
So now we'll go to... Yeah. Okay, we're done. We can leave, right? Yeah.
I'll keep an eye out.
So Todd Lockwood is the newest writer up here. He was a painter for many, many years, and he decided to take that leap into wordsmithing. What's it been like for you coming into exactly what Terry's talking about, modern fantasy?
That's a good question. I've had a couple of different reviewers say that my book is both classical and modern. And both times it makes me go, I wonder what they meant. It has dragons in it, and it on its face looks like fantasy, but there's no dwarves, no elves. It's very political. There's some philosophy in it, and so it's not just, you know, chasing a sword or or the magic thing, or, you know, finding the big boss at the end, although I suppose that has to happen at some point. But a lot of the things that led me to write the book were modern day issues, things going on in the real world that I just had to say something about or explode.
Yeah, Django, go ahead. What do you think about your own work? Because you mix, there's gun, I mean, you're more military in many ways.
Yes. I mean, and that's nothing new. There's a long trend of military fantasy going back to people like Glenn Cook, and even before. I drew a lot on S.M. Sterling and David Drake, both did a lot of military, although S.M. Sterling, he does this thing that science fiction authors used to do when they wanted to write fantasy, which is like, it's a fantasy, but it's all on a fallen colony world in the distant future, so it's actually science fiction, we swear. I mean, for me, I think I agree with Terry. I would call modern fantasy basically anything in the era after people started writing things other than Tolkienian fantasy. I feel like Tolkien and D&D defined fantasy for one epoch, and then sort of as people got away from that gets us into the modern era of fantasy. And some of that goes way back. I mean, people have obviously been doing different things since the dawn of time, but like, you know, it's really like
expected tropes.
Yeah, in the mainstream, it's really sort of the past 20, 30 years. The thing that I have been doing, and that a lot of other people have been doing, that makes me really excited about fantasy now, is that I feel like we're getting away from the sort of default setting of basically 12th and 13th century Europe, where, you know, knights and castles and you know, kings and so on. And so, you know, my stuff is in sort of 18th century context, and there are other people writing ancient stuff or set in different places and different times, and that sort of breadth of inspiration for the settings, I think, is really refreshing.
Yeah, I think Robin started writing kind of right around the tail end of that Tolkien-esque push, right? So what was it like kind of coming in with Assassin's Apprentice?
Well, for me, as like many writers of my age, Tolkien was really a watershed event. I'd never read anything like The Lord of the Rings. I'd read a lot of pulp era, Doc Savage and Tarzan and Conan, which I would say is definitely fantasy. I've read comic books with, you know, Avengers and Wolverines and Black Hawk and all kinds of things that had a lot of fantasy mixed in. But for me, what made The Lord of the Rings so different was that suddenly I was caring about these characters on a much deeper level. So for me, the stories that were the characters and what their thoughts and feelings were, to me that is modern fantasy, rather than a quickly told tale of just what happened and you imagine how they felt about it.
So that's good. So when you started writing Fitz, then, I mean, Fitz is a very personal character. I mean, you're very attached to him right from the first page. So that was in the back of your mind?
It was in the back of my mind that I wanted people, I really wanted to pull the reader deeply into the story and have them feel what the story was about, as well as know the events of the story. Right. And what goes into causing these events to happen.
But I mean, the interesting thing about your stuff, especially coming at the time that it did, is that it's not about Fitz on a quest to defeat the Dark Lord of all evil or destroy magic jewelry, right? Like, so many books were. Right?
Not yet.
I read probably 100 books with roughly that description when I was growing up.
Quest books, yes.
Sorry, I mean, and so I guess if I can ask you a question, it's like, why? You know, if everyone else was doing that, what, you know, where did you diverge from
Where did you go
the
wrong?
thing. It was clearly where did you go right, given the subsequent history, but it must have been.
Well, I had actually started writing in about 1972, writing books as Megan Lindholm that were more traditional fantasy books in some ways, going back more to Fatford and the Grey Mouser, and they were just quick adventures, and I didn't really try to explain, what is the sacrifice involved in this, or what is the moral question that arises with this. But with Fitz, that was really what had become to fascinate me, is what is the hero put out there, and who is the hero?
Right.
But we kind of.
Right. Now that we've answered that question definitively, Kevin is just going to sing a song. Green sleeves was my pride.
I don't. In terms of modern fantasy, I'm writing urban fantasy with the Iron Druid stuff, and like some of these folks have been saying, I like to get away from the quest stuff. Especially what I love about urban fantasy is the mashup quality to it, is that you can take stuff that's been out there in other cultures and so on and put it in our modern context and then see what happens. But of course I had things that I was really enjoying, like I am a tree hugger kind of person, so I have a druid as my main character. My editor Trisha can attest to my honest tree hugging skills. We were down in San Diego at the Comic-Con there a few years ago, and both of us rather enjoy wearing black, but I saw a white tree and I thought, well, that is so harmless. I'll hug it. But it had a powdery bark, so I hugged it, and then I came away and I'm like, oh my God, I just had, something, I've got cocaine all over me. and so that was a pretty fun time. But I love that part of it, that there's an environmental message. It just seems like, I wish it wasn't coming true, but we really are getting in more and more of an environmental crisis. And then I also have this theme throughout here that there's not just a tolerance of other faiths different from your own, but a complete acceptance that they are all real and all valid and all valued. And that also seems to be a message that I wish we didn't have to get out there, but it's important. So I think fantasy is a way for us to examine some of these things at a sort of a tiny bit of a safe remove, so that you don't instantly have your buttons pushed because you are in a fictional thing, but then you can start thinking about those issues, and how they apply to your real life. So
You're kind of approaching this from an interesting point of view, because you entered in right around the time where urban fantasy was really hitting its stride and people were reading it, Jim Butcher, Anita Blake, all that stuff.
mm-hmm.
But your initial idea was for an epic fantasy, and you've reworked it, and I'm reading it right now. It's really good. That comes out later this year. What's it like going from urban fantasy into epic for you? And what are you trying to do with it and avoid sometimes?
Okay, so I have a background. I used to teach high school English, and I was teaching the Odyssey and the Iliad and Beowulf and all of that kind of stuff. So I really got into the original epics and how they were told, and I was always fascinated by the idea of a bard telling a story each night around the fire in heroic couplets with a lyre and probably quite a bit of mead. And I thought, well, we don't really do that anymore. Is there a way that I can kind of adapt that to prose to kind of give readers something like that experience? So my epic that's coming out in October, A Plague of Giants, is framed by a bard who is performing in the persona of 10 different characters. That's his magical ability, is to have a seeming, and so he looks like somebody else and talks like somebody else and tells their story, their experiences of the war. That is actually still in progress. We have giants coming from two different coasts, attacking a continent that's been at peace for many years, and these people have to figure out how to stop what seems unstoppable. So that, the war thing is obviously something that's been present in epics forever, but I'm trying to tell it in a way, kind of a newish way, structurally, that hasn't been done before, I don't think. So I hope folks dig
I
it.
haven't seen anybody writing about what it does with refugees quite the way you're handling it in The Plague of Giants. And-
You're reading it? Oh my god.
No, no.
Yeah.
No, I'm reading it.
And Kevin just started sweating.
Yeah. I didn't know
There's
she
a
was reading it.
grammatical error on page.
I told him about it.
Robert's like, I'm reading it, and let me tell you, it's got some problems. That's like the worst nightmare.
It's been a really intriguing presentation with the Bard. So
Thank you.
yes. I think we're
We're gonna talk now.
All right, we have a quick question already over here. Eventually we'll line up. I'll let you guys know when we can line up, but his hand's been up for a while.
I'm currently writing almost kind of like the Iron Druid, an environmental message book about someone who protects nature. Do you mind if I speak with you after this?
No, go ahead.
Bring cookies. Or beer. Or beer.
Tacos.
So, there's for my own work, I'm very Arthurian legend driven, and obviously that's a long time ago. So, when it comes to inspirations and where you guys come from when it comes to your own evolution of writing, where do you, like, obviously Tolkien played a role in what you do, but not all fantasy comes from other fantasy, right?
No, no. In fact, Tolkien is a long time ago and far away for me. And if I were still writing about in Tolkien style and still developing then, I would be marginalized in a way that I don't like to think about. So these days, most of my inspiration does not come from fantasy. I read a lot from fantasy, but I read more that impacts the way I think and it helps me develop the stories I want to tell from other forms of literature and from my daily newspaper or online or anywhere these days, and it makes me very, very angry. So I am doing quite a bit right now about looking at. Well, I'm writing the end of the genre series, so I thought the end should go out with something of a bang, as it were, just as I probably will here shortly. So I'm writing about what I see as I see as an evolution between magic and science, which because I believe life is cyclical and all things come around, they go away, they come around again. So I'm working from that perspective, and I'm looking at what happens if you finally have a resolution of some kind between magic and science, because magic has been on the downswing since the start of that series, and science has been creeping back into the picture. And as it's crept further back into the picture, it's starting to become more of the predominant source of power and what drives the world of the four lands. So I'm looking at that now, and that's definitely very modern and very not fantasy-like. So I think that there's a lot of room for both, and you can do that, and that's kind of where I'm at.
And that's your evolution. That's kind of where your own work is.
Yeah, I think here's what now Robin and I have been doing this for about the same amount of time, and I think that as you, at least for me, and I think that the longer you're in this, the more you want to do something else. You just want to spread your wings and go elsewhere, and I've done this with the Magic Kingdom series and Word and Void on a small scale, and I'm still looking to take the story in a different way, and I'm working right now on I'm almost done with it actually, a book about, I guess I call it futuristic, which is something different for me, but it's got the same kind of tropes involved. So, it's like that.
What about you, Todd? You evolved out of painting. So,
Yeah, I think my first, Tolkien was a huge influence, obviously, and Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard, those pillars of fantasy. But I grew up on science fiction more than anything, and I really enjoy a world with logic and sense in it, where you can't just explain everything away with, oh, there's a spell, or there's a whatever. I was determined not to write a book that looked like it came from D&D, because that's easy. That's just too easy. And I didn't want people to read my book and go, oh, he's writing D&D now too. No, I'm not writing D&D. Really, I was writing a story about people and the culture, and I dressed it up in dragons because I like dragons.
And Django, you have a couple series, so how do you decide between them? And I mean, the evolution of a writer, how do you choose?
Well, I like doing different things. Like Terry was saying, like I started out with this. This is a sort of military fantasy in an 18th century context, and the inspiration for that just came from reading a lot of history books and wargaming. Basically, I had some friends of mine who I had a wargaming group with, and they started lending me history books, which I'd always thought of as kind of boring, and then they started giving me good ones. You know, I've started this a little more recently than some of the other people at this table. And so for me, in the fantasy line, the big thing that sparked this was probably George Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire. And you know, as I got into history, I really loved what he did with that series, which was sort of take the traditional sort of D&D Knights and Castles fantasy and bring it back closer to its historical roots in sort of 12th and 13th century England and Scotland. And I said, you know, I want to do that, do a fantasy that's close to a historical analog, but not with that time period, because like he did that one and it's really good and I don't need to just copy it. And then later I was reading about Napoleon and it just kind of clicked that that would be the thing to do. Whereas this series is much more, I mean, it's clearly inspired by a lot of the sort of children's literature classics, so Chronicles of Narnia, Harry Potter sort of more proximately. This one was almost directly inspired by some conversations I had with a few people about how in Harry Potter, Dumbledore always kind of creeps me out because he's like constantly recklessly endangering the minors in his care and like sending them into horrible danger that he could easily take care of himself but doesn't.
I knew you'd figure it out.
And so like we, you know, in Harry Potter we accept it because, you know, we know that Dumbledore has everyone's best interest in mind, but I wanted to write a story from the point of view of the kid who doesn't actually know if this mentor figure has your best interest in mind, you know. So I think of it as the sketchy Dumbledore scenario. He just turns up and he's like, "You're the chosen one. Now go kill those guys over there." And you're like,
And I'll drink tea over
why?
here. I'll be hiding over here.
Am I sure I'm supposed to be killing these guys? What did they ever do to me? So anyway, that's kind of where that came from.
And you also go through, you go different series, but kind of in the same world too, kind of, Robin. How?
Most of the Robin Hobb books have been set in the same world, with the exception of the Soldier's Son trilogy. But it's, you know, you get an idea, or more likely a character steps out, and you just really want to follow them and see what they're up to and what they're thinking and what they're doing. So it's, I think a lot of it happens in a part of our brains that we don't have conscious access to. That, you know, you sit down with that blank screen in front of you, and things just start unfolding from there. So to step back and forth, I mean, it's like right now I'm reading 3 different books. So I'm jumping from Kevin's to, and I finished Kristen's, but I'm jumping from world to world when I'm reading, so I think it's natural to, when you write, to suddenly say, oh, you know, I read these 2 books and then I went, what if, kind of like what you said, and now there's something, a storyline I want to follow.
Yeah.
Cool. The question is about your evolution of fantasy?
Yeah.
It's been a while since the question was asked.
We'll come back to, because I want to talk about fairy tales too, because kind of all of this kind of springs out of fairy tales, older fairy tales, and I think there's kind of a newer, there's an evolution that includes fairy tales right now in the present, which I think there's a couple books we could talk about. But yeah, like, I mean, Atticus is grounded in mythology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, that's my educational background in terms of like the stuff that I was expected to teach, but then also there was a lot of stuff that, you know, I was taught and, you know, that I learned in college that of course never gets taught to high schoolers because, my God, people are having sex in myth, so we can't have that. we can decapitate all the things we want, but nobody will ever have a penis. So
This is why high schoolers don't pay attention.
In terms of my personal evolution, though, in terms of like what I really enjoy as a writer and what I try to challenge myself to do, it's all about voice and taking on different voices and language patterns, because I am fascinated by that and how language patterns are physical brains. You know, we used to read quite a bit about, you know, how do people acquire language, and then what does that do to your thought processes and so on, and how your own personal lexicon is going to differ from person to person, and it will of course change your speech patterns and so on. So that's my nerdy kind of thing that I really enjoy. As I go through my career, you can see that I keep adding different voices. So I started to add a point of view from Grania Whale, and now I have Owen. In the Iron Druid Chronicles, I had almost like a miniature Canterbury Tales thing going on in book 3. But then in Plague of Giants, my epic fantasy, I've got 11 different first-person points of view. I couldn't have done that before. I wrote, 9 other books first. But I got to the point where I would really like to explore this and really try this out. And the first version of it, I had 13 points of view, and Trisha said, maybe you should cut a couple. So I did, and it worked out great, actually. But it tightened everything up, and so that's been a real joy for me, is to figure out how the speech patterns are different, and I think character gets revealed that way. I walk around Seattle and I see so many cool folks, and I think, wow, what would their story be like, and how would they talk? And that's kind of what I like to do as a writer these days. So.
When it comes to, go ahead, Terry.
I just wanted to say he was always strange as a child too. Can I go off record here off the road for a minute?
Do it.
Something that that Robin said a minute ago caught my attention, and she said that talking about sitting down to a blank screen and then trying to make something happen. And I'm discovering, and I don't know if this is an age thing or not, but if I sit down in front of a blank screen with an open mind about where things are going, it goes nowhere. I can't do that. I can't create like that anymore. And what happens is because everything's fragmenting around me, I think, is that all my ideas that are worth anything come at places like this, when I'm up here talking about this, and I'm thinking, why am I wasting my time up here? I should be home writing this down right now because it's important, or if I'm taking a shower, or if I'm, whatever the heck. And it comes unbidden, and it comes, it's non-sequential, and it's intrusive, and it's always there, pressing in, saying, oh, here, you need to know this. Pay attention to this. This is important. You could use this. That sort of thing. But if I don't sit down to the computer with a definite idea of what it is I want to write any time, rather than just I think I'll see if something happens, I can't function at all. And I just was wondering if anybody else has this problem, or if the lure of coin and the threat of debtors drives you to perform.
What you're describing is the way it's kind of always been for me, that I just keep a file of all the random little bits and pieces that come to me, and when I get to the point where I'm like, okay, I need to start a new project, I go and read through it, and often end up drawing on pieces of 2 or 3 different things, 2 or 3 different ideas that I've had over the past however many months.
Validation.
But even after all these years, I still carry a notebook. And this is a nice size for it. I can fit it. I used to use the steno notebooks because they would fit in a diaper bag. And now this one fits in my purse pretty well. But it's like Terry says, you're trying to have a cup of coffee or something, and suddenly you get this, somebody walks by and you say, oh, what if that person is not what he looks like? Or what if, or you see somebody do something and you say, that makes no sense unless. And then for me, it's like trapping a butterfly or something. If I don't get that down right away, 2 hours later I'll be saying, I saw that woman and I had this really cool idea and now I can't remember what it was.
Yeah, that's the worst feeling.
Yeah,
It
that's
is.
the worst.
Or driving and you actually have to pull over. It's worse than getting on your cell phone.
Oh, there's times when I can't get to the computer fast enough and find a spot to type it, and it's gone.
Yeah,
And I go,
it's-
damn it!
I could compare it to trying to remember a dream where you wake up and you've had that full dream, and then you go and have that first cup of coffee, and then you can't remember.
Yeah.
So you can take voice memos on your cell phone. Sometimes, like I'm sitting somewhere and I'll be like, hang on a second. Okay, remember to do the thing about the guy who's an armadillo. Okay.
And then 2 weeks later, you open your notebook or you
You're
turn
like,
on your phone and go
"What?"
like, what was that?
Okay, there's a.
Why was that important?
On that note, there's a microphone in the middle of the room, so we'll start taking questions now. I got a quick question for you guys. Really, when we look at all your work up here, there's kind of one subgenre that's not really represented here at all, and that's grimdark. Have any of you had any interest in that evolution of the fantasy genre?
Start at that end.
I tried to write Hounded was supposed to be really dark, so that failed. I seriously thought I was writing the darkest, most badass stuff. And so there you go, I'm just not cut out for grimdark. I still try to write badass stuff and it comes out being funny, so. It's worked for me though, so I guess I'm not gonna stop. I'm just gonna continue to be really dark.
Mysterious.
Yeah.
Mysterious.
I love reading it. I love Joe Abercrombie and God, all the names fall out of my head the second I open my mouth. For me, I think the first thing that touched that vein with me was Glenn Cook's, I love reading it, but that doesn't fit with how I tell a story.
Mm-hmm.
I think that people often confuse the trappings of grimdark with the essence. I have a whole lecture about this. I'll give it to you if you're interested. Come find me at the signing or something. But I think that the essence of grimdark, which Joe Abercrombie gets and like KJ Parker gets, and there's a few other really great ones, is like this really deep cynicism about human nature. Like the essence of Joe Abercrombie's books is always like, are people really fundamentally good? No, they are not.
Mark Lawrence.
Yeah, Mark
that's
Lawrence.
the name.
Mark Lawrence, yeah.
If you read Best Served Cold, it asks this very clear question of like, can people change for the better? And then answers it like, definitely not. And I don't know, that kind of like like Robin said, I like reading it, but that kind of message is not a message that I go for.
Yeah.
I think my first grimdark fantasy was Alice in Wonderland. That's a horror for me.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
I think the question presupposes that you can write grimdark,
Yeah.
and I can't write it. I don't have a connection with the material like you. I would read it, but I've never been compelled to write that kind of story because I tend to have a more positive attitude about things, believe it or not. In my version of life, the good guys win and the bad guys lose. Oh, that's being tested right now.
Yeah, I feel like there's been a tiny rebuttal in the last maybe year because I've read some really good, going back to the whole fairy tale thing, how all this kind of sprang to be into modern fantasy. There's been some really good fairy tale books in the last year or so, like Uprooted.
Yeah.
How many here have read Uprooted?
The rest of you should.
Have the rest of you read
What about Uprooted by
the
Amy
Bear?
Novick?
Bear and the Nightingale?
The Bear and the Nightingale?
Yeah.
There you go.
Oh, Catherine Arden, absolutely magical, wonderful. No cynicism, just we leave the book feeling really good.
And like,
Oddly.
Yeah. Okay, question time. First guy, let's go.
Pretty basic question. How do you go from a seed of an idea, a guy who is actually an armadillo, to a full-fledged book series?
Slowly.
yeah, it takes a long time. I always like to preface stuff like this by saying that like process is super personal and it really varies from person to person. So this is just me, and I'm sure everyone at this table and in this room will be different. I do a lot of outlining, and I do it in sort of steadily increasing detail.
Mm-hmm.
So you start with a very simple concept, and then you think about your character arcs and the plot that you need to go, and I sort of sketch a couple of bullet points that get me from beginning to end, and then I write a sort of very loose skeleton of what the story would be like, and then I do a scene by scene outline my outlines have been getting longer and longer. My last one was 17,000 words, and my editor was like, "What are you doing?" And then I write the actual draft.
Does it come from questions for you when you're building those plot points in? Is it questions that drive your plot pointing?
It's
Like,
not-
what color would the armadillo be, and where's that armadillo from?
It's
And
kind of. It's more like figuring out what I need for the characters. Like, I tend to let characters drive plot and world building, so that the world serves the story and not the other way around.
I think you need to have more than one ingredient. It's like making a soup or a stew. You know, if all you've got is a chicken, it's gonna not be that exciting. So if you've got the guy who's an armadillo, then you throw in the person who worships ants, and you throw in you gather other ingredients and say, you know, let's put these in a bag and shake them up and get some good conflicts going. And for me, it's always one idea is never enough. I'd get an idea and I'd write it on a piece of paper and shove it in my desk drawer. This is pre-computer age. And then sooner or later, you know, you open the desk drawer and you look and you've got these interesting things, and you suddenly see, oh, it's like a jigsaw puzzle. This goes here and that goes there. And now I've got a really good conflict going, and characters that are going to interact in an exciting way.
Thank you very much.
Hello.
I'm nervous. So you guys were talking earlier in the contrast between Tolkien-esque and more modern fantasy. You guys all seem to have like themes, socio-political or otherwise, that you're kind of using fantasy as a proxy to say. Would you say that modern fantasy is more focused on that than the traditional Tolkien quest to get jewelry destroyed?
I'd say it is, and I kind of like it that way myself. As just speaking as a reader, I obviously I'm tired of reading about what white guys want to destroy. So I'd like to see what, you know, I'm really enjoying the wonderful renaissance we're actually experiencing right now of a lot of different voices out there talking about a lot of issues that are not white dude centered. And so this is a great time to be reading fantasy, honestly.
I also, I kind of dispute the premise that the classical fantasy didn't have a message. I mean, sometimes it's a little more deeply embedded and people didn't really think about it as much, but everything has a message. But Tolkien's writing about the decline of the society that he grew up in, right? That this sort of the golden age. Yeah, the golden age of England, the old days before the war, and the decline of that. I mean, it's pretty clear when you look at it. So, you know, in some ways the messages have changed, but I'm not sure there's more than there used to be.
I think that it's not always a good idea to write stories that are too politically oriented. I think that many of us are pretty sick and tired of being beaten to death by somebody's political message. It's more interesting to discover it on your own, and I think good literature in any form always leaves it somewhat up to the reader to decide what the answers are, or what the problems are, or anything they're to discover. It's a journey of discovery. Reading is a journey of discovery, and you're. I always felt like when you write something, you always write it so that the reader meets you halfway. You never write too much. You never tell too much. You always let the reader come to you and decide for themselves, you know, what's what. A perfect example is I've written, I get asked now that I'm involved with this damn TV show, I get asked all the time, how come there are people of color in your TV series? There are none in the books. I said, how do you know that? Take a look. And they said, well, everything else is pretty straightforward. And I said, well, how many gay characters have you counted? And they said, well, aren't any? And I said, yes, there are. You haven't been looking. And I just feel like it's better that the readers have the opportunity to see this rather than make it the central focal point of what the story is about. The only thing I care about is one thing. For me, it's all about this character is in a whole lot of trouble. How can I make it worse? That's what I'm interested in, because we read in order to be engaged, and for this kind of adventure storytelling, which is what I do, we're reading to be transported and excited by the storyline. So for me, that is more important than any kind of message.
Thank you.
Hi. My question was, you all developed these worlds with complex magical systems and political systems, governments, all that kind of thing. And I was wondering if you have any advice for how to kind of subtly include that information without it coming as a kind of exposition dump that distracts from the character-driven story.
I do all mine. All mine's through dialogue.
I can't keep up with you guys.
Well, I think, I'll answer this, because I think it's an easy answer. Is you don't ever do an info dump, because it hits you right in the face, and you're thinking, this is an info dump, for God's sake, quick, kill it. What you do is, when you need to know something, you tell it. It's always about what do you need to know at that moment. And there's a whole bunch of things that you're going to reveal along the way that don't need to be known all in one spot. So you build things. As a guy who has written 26 long, endless books about one world, I can tell you that I didn't start out knowing what book 25 was going to be. I've never been that far ahead. It's always a case of, this is something I write something, I'll say, okay, now I'll have to remember this is something I need to tell later on. That sort of thing. And I think really that's the whole secret to how you spread it out and make it feel organic.
It comes down to show, don't tell, and that is, if you want to convince people that the populace is being too heavily taxed, you have somebody who, is telling his kids, I know this is not much for dinner, but we've had to set aside this much because they're coming to collect this wheat, and if we don't have it, we're in big trouble. And so it's showing what the problem is rather than saying, in this kingdom there was a very heavy tax on farmers.
My rule has always been, you make people curious first and then tell them. You don't info dump by just putting a bunch of stuff up front. You tell the story, and then at the point in the story where the reader's like, hey, I want to know this, then you tell them, because then they don't mind the exposition if you have to use exposition, right? And that helps a lot, and it ties back to what Terry said about you give them what they need to know. They don't need to know the genealogical history of the king or how the electoral system works. They just need to know whatever the stuff that's relevant is. But you have to tell them why they need to know it first, or they're going to be like, this is all boring and stupid.
I try to do it in dialogue because it's in the moment. And you can't have somebody talking for 3 pages.
You definitely
You
can.
But
I met some of those people.
editors don't like that.
You wrote that book.
There it was.
Is it Plague of Giants just someone talking for like 400 pages?
No, there's a lot of grimdark in it too.
So I've noticed a lot of stuff with you guys' books that it's not like magic-filled worlds. I mean, Terry's gotten away from it, but like not everybody has the ability, so everybody's growing. There's not like all-powerful one person kind of thing. Your heroes and such. Do you ever find yourself writing and getting stuck? Like you get up to a situation and suddenly you're following the character, your main person, and then you don't know how they're going to get out of it?
Boy, I wish I had a
You have to go
spell
back.
right now.
Yeah, that kind of thing. That's what my version of modern fantasy is the fact that they're struggling through, you've got the world, there's different situations, you don't have one person. It's not kind of like the Eddings that you always had one person, everybody from this country had this ability kind of thing. So do you find yourself that you're having to rewrite things because your character took you down to a dead-end path?
The only magic in my book is very low key. So when a character gets in trouble, they have to think their way out of it, or fight their way out, or both. But there's not going to be a fireball that solves the situation for them. And I prefer it that way. I'd rather see people thinking and overcoming difficulties rather than throw them a magic bone that does whatever they need to do to get out of a mess.
I think everybody struggles with writing books at some point or another, probably more than once, probably more than 10 or 12 times. And I think writing yourself into a corner is part and parcel of what you do. I do it sometimes deliberately. I mean, this is really foolish, but it is kind of interesting too, you know, and you think, I think I'll put this guy in an impossible situation and see what how he get himself out.
You're weird.
But I do think that that's
No,
it's not an unusual thing, and I most of the time when you get yourself in a position like that, I really think the best thing to do is, go watch some television or something. Go read a book.
I've definitely
Call Terry.
gotten to a point in my outline
What do I do?
where it says so and so does this, and I look at it and I'm like, wait, how? That doesn't seem possible. As to the level of magic, though, I really think it depends on the kind of story you're wanting to tell. I mean, there's, if you're telling a story like The Wheel of Time or like Stephen Erickson's Malazan Book of the Fallen, which is basically about, all-powerful wizards having giant magical battles, then there's a high-powered level of magic in the world. Whereas if you're writing a story like mine, which is about people fighting in a kind of Napoleonic Wars context, then having all-powerful wizards would kind of make that seem sort of pointless.
I kind of think, maybe you can talk about this now that I've interrupted you. But I think that what's interesting about stories is the failings and weaknesses of the characters in crucial situations and how they stand up to being tested with those and what they do to overcome them. And I'm always looking more interested in characters that have handicaps of one kind or another that they have to deal with than we are with the all-powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. I can tell you that if you do have an issue with my fourth book, Tricked, I turned it all in, and then Trisha came back to me and said, why don't we just try the ending completely different? So that was 10,000 words, that I highlighted and pressed delete, and just completely redid it. No, it was good. That was a good decision, and so because she was completely right. But I had just gone down the wrong path, and took that wrong path all the way to the end, and then it was like, no, we should maybe go back up the road and take this different path instead. So, and that's fine. I mean, I'm not the first writer, and I won't be the last who has to just cut gigantic sections of the text and redo it. But I'm so glad that it happened. Honestly, I learned a lot in that process. So.
Okay, we're getting short on time here, so I'll have to do some quick ones, hopefully.
Okay, so my question is, when you're writing characters, do you ever find that they get away from you, so to speak? Like they take on a life of their own and start doing things that you never intended for them to do and going down paths that you had never planned out?
Yeah, I introduced a minor character in chapter 1 who was just supposed to help accomplish a certain task, and he intruded into my story. He's become a character who's probably going to stick around. They do that. They have minds of their own.
And once that starts, sometimes it's a relief because suddenly the book is going faster than you can type. And you have to just keep up with the characters and you're praying they don't, do the Wile E. Coyote right into the wall. No, that's, when that starts, I think I always think of that as a good sign.
It's funny, it's not something that happens to me, or maybe it happens at an earlier stage because I do a lot of sort of outlining and planning. I think that happens to me sort of when I'm sitting around pondering it. By the time I actually start writing a draft, things are pretty well nailed down. It's while I'm sort of sitting around noodling that sort of thing happens.
It happened to me when I gave the guy a name. All of a sudden, now he's a character.
In book 2, they were not in my outline. Book 2, Hext, I was just writing along, following my outline, and then all of a sudden I was like, a priest and a rabbi walk into a pagan bookshop. Like one of those really bad jokes, right? And so I did it. I had them walk in there, and I'm like, what if they were creepy? and then you know, and the owner of the pagan bookstore doesn't really know how to handle it. So I mean, that was where the Hammers of God came in. They were not in my outline. They wound up sticking around, and I thought they were sort of fascinating and cool. So then they became part of the book, and then, you know, they obviously became a larger part of the third book, and then the 8th book. So things like when I write an outline, I never feel beholden to it. It's there to keep me productive every day, so that if I don't know what to write, I could just, well, I should be writing that chapter now. So I have something. I'm productive every day, and I'm producing words. So I meet my deadlines, but I also don't feel beholden to it. If another idea comes along, well then let's have fun with it.
What's the nicest compliment somebody's ever given you that's made you really proud of your books?
Terry said. Compelling, fully realized.
Sometimes
story.
people come up to you and say they never read a book, and then I read your book. I mean, that's pretty heart-wrenching. Or they say, yeah, this book changed my life. It came at the right time. It got me through a very difficult period. I don't think there's any greater compliment than somebody telling you that you made a difference in their lives. I'm done. That's it.
Yeah, that happens to me too. Like, folks, there are certain passages, I guess, in the third book when Atticus is saying goodbye to the widow McDonough, just in case he never sees her again. I wrote that because I didn't get a chance to say goodbye to my father before he passed. So a lot of people related to that, and one of the things he says to her at that time was about, you know, your life has been a blessing to everybody who meets you, etc. And that wound up being the most quoted passage, like on Goodreads, you know what I mean, when people quote stuff. So, and I didn't realize that was going to be the thing that stuck around. You know, most people just come to me and say, "I like sausages too." But there are moments like that, you know, that come along. And so, I think that anything like that where people say there's been a really emotional connection with something that you wrote there, that's always the best compliment.
All of the above, and then when you hear from somebody, oh, you know, my mom gave this to me, and then I passed it on to my sister, and now her kids have read it, and you're going, wow, that's really, really a good feeling.
What keep us in business?
I agree with all of that. To add one, you know, one of the inspirations for this book was Steve Sterling, who is a writer that I grew up reading, and then my editor sent him the manuscript, and he gave me a quote for the back, but he also just emailed me and said how much he liked it, and he bothers me to get the latest draft as soon as it's ready, and so that was really meaningful to me.
Yeah, for me in The Dark Thorn, it was definitely getting Terry read my book and said, "Wow, great book. No, you got completely reread it."
Cool, thank you.
So, thank you very much. My question actually is maybe a little more for Mr. Wexler, just because you've mentioned outlining a lot. I'm sure you all have plans.
On my mind.
Yeah, you all have plans for where you go with your stories. Just one situation that I've run into, I don't know how many people here have, but a few others I've talked to too. When do you think your outline suddenly starts to get a little bit too monstrous and maybe it's time to just start writing the book? Because like at this point, my OneNote notebooks and my cloud storage are screaming, you know, like turn this into a book so you can delete me.
Right.
You don't delete them, you save them for posterity.
Oh, there you go.
There's literally a guy at, I forget which university he's at, but he bothers me to send him my manuscripts because he's like, we're saving it for the posterity. I'm like, no one is ever going to care. Maybe if I was Robin or Terry, they'd care. I mean, again, it's a process thing and it's personal. I mean, you can go all the way from like, you know, just expanding and expanding the outline until it turns into a draft. Like that's possible. The level of detail I get to is usually about 1 paragraph per scene. My outlines, and the thing I try to watch out for is things that aren't a scene. I think of them as potholes, which is not a great word because it sounds like plot holes, which is a different problem. But when you've got a piece in your outline that says something like Bob and Jim become friends, then like that's not a scene. You can't write that because that's not like a physical thing that happens. Like Bob and Jim have a conversation about their shared love of like 80s comedies at a bar. That's a scene. And so for me, once I've got the outline to the point where it's one scene after another all the way through, then it's time to start writing the draft. But that's just my process, and you can do a much less detailed outline or even a more detailed outline if it works for you.
Yeah, it sounds like all of you appear outlined to certain degrees. So no, Robin, no. No, the boo and the hiss happens.
Because if you outline, by the time you get around to writing it, you're bored with the story, and then you make things happen just to see what else it is. So sometimes editors really want an outline, and writing an outline is good because it gives you a possible map to the end of the book. But
sometimes there's potholes.
or you know, it's for me, it's more like going on a road trip where you know that you're going to visit 3 or 4 cities, and this is your ultimate destination.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't know about the detours in between, or the bridges that are out, or the hitchhiker you pick up. So I don't.
That's really dangerous. Don't pitch.
I should say that I used to hate doing outlines, and then I was forced to do them by an editor who, you know, I sold the first book in this series, and they were like, we want outlines for the other 4 books. And I was like, oh, God. So I laboriously did this outline, and it was the worst month of writing I ever did. But then when it came time to write the second book and I had the outline, I was like, this is way easier. And I'm doing way less backtracking, and so it kind of made me a convert.
Robin, you just turned in a massive book that finishes a trilogy. So the end of those end chapters, how much of that did you know before you started writing the first book?
Some of that I have known since I wrote the introduction to Assassin's Apprentice.
Wow.
Some of it, but you know, some of those scenes you carry with you. You don't know if you're ever actually going to write them. But I think we all know a lot of what happens before our books begin, and off to the side with minor characters who stepped off the stage, and we know things that happen after our book ends. And we don't necessarily say, I'm going to write that scene someday. But then sometimes you do. You reach the point of saying, and now I'm going to write that scene.
Yeah, what about you, Terry? I mean, you're wrapping up the chronological end of Shanra. The end that you have in mind, how long have you had that in your mind?
Ever since I became afraid of Brandon Sanderson.
That has to be explained.
That needs to be explained. I'll let Terry do it.
Well, Brandon wrote the end to Wheel of Time after Robert Jordan died, and I thought, maybe I won't live forever. So maybe I should write the ending to my book before somebody else jumps in there, or I know my publisher would bring somebody in, so I'll cut them off at the pass, then if they want to write something else, I don't care. As I joke with him, he's heard me do this before, does Head Brandon, so I'm not, picking on him or anything, I'm just saying, I'm really, after all this time, I don't want somebody else writing the ending of this series, so that's why I'm doing it.
We used to joke that, I'd go on a trip and I'd say, if I don't come back, tell Brandon where my notes are.
I agree with what Robin says. For me, it's always a case of when I finish something, or even in the middle of a book sometimes, I kind of know where I want to go with this later, maybe, but always at the end of a book, I know what the next book is going to be. If I write it, I know what this book would be. Just something about writing, the process of writing a book tells you a whole lot about where it needs to go or what would become of these people, but I will never tell you.
Any other questions? It sounds like we got a little bit more time, maybe.
About
5 minutes-ish?
It's the race to the mic.
4 minutes.
Okay, well mine should be fairly quick. I was wondering, for each of you, is there a book you think that everyone should read other than your own?
Like a book?
Well, yeah, sure.
Everyone just say the next person in line.
Yeah, right. Obviously, everything that you heard up here, because I'm a shill for my publisher, and paid well, I might add, I would suggest you read Callie Bates, who's here this weekend, and who has written a new book called The Waking Land, and you can find it downstairs at Del Rey. And if you get tired of that idea, or you want to pass on to the next good book, everybody should read Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk by Ben Fountain. He was here at Arts and Lectures the other night, very interesting guy. But that book will tell you more about war than any book you'll ever read.
By the way, Callie Bates, I think, has a signing at the Random House booth at 4 o'clock today, so you might want to go down there, maybe, just saying. Yeah.
I'm going to answer your question a little sideways. I just came across a book that Lou Anders, who's a writer and former editor, turned me on to called The Secrets of Story by Matt Bird. And it's one of the most useful books on the craft of writing that I've come across. And I've read a lot of them over the last decade of learning, this new craft. Secrets of Story, I'm pretty sure it's Matt Bird. Really, really useful insights on, all the things that we already know, like characterization and plot development and stuff, but he just drills into all of it in a way I hadn't seen before. And I've read McKee's story and The Writer's Journey and all those mainstays, but I think this is a really good one. I would encourage anybody who wants to improve their craft. Secrets of Story.
Who is it by?
I'm pretty sure it's Matt Bird.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't know that I can answer this question. I'd have to say, all the things I want to pick are really popular, so lots of people probably already read them anyway. I'd have to pick something by Terry Pratchett, either Reaper Man or Small Gods. I think are both like masterpieces. Good Omens also. Good Omens is amazing, but everyone in the world I feel like has read that already, as they should. Oh, well, you should.
I'd go back and say, if you've only seen the movies, read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. If you've already read those, think of the movie that's based on a book that you love the movie, and go back and actually read the book. Whether it's the Jungle Book, which is totally unlike anything that ever was animated on the screen, or Watership Down, or Dune. But
definitely read the book.
Yeah.
But definitely, if there's one that you love, go back to the roots, and if there's a movie you love, go back to the roots and read the book.
I'd say Wake of Vultures by Lila Bowen. If you have not read that one yet, it's a Weird West thing, but it's such a good voice, and I loved it. It was my favorite book of 2015. And if you pick up the cover, in the bookstore, you will basically see these incredible glowing reviews from all of the writers ever. So I guess it's like it's a favorite of all writers. Basically, we were really impressed with what she did there. So
Thank you very much.
I'm in the middle of Red Sister by Mark Lawrence right now. It comes out next month. Write it down. It's unrelated to everything else he's written, but it's fantastic. It's the best thing he's written, I think. So.
Oh, that's saying a lot.
It is. Yeah, I'm in love with that right now.
I have just finished therapy over Mark Lawrence. I am not going back. Not really.
You're not finished.
No, I'm not.
Do you think that classical token-esque fantasy still has a place in publishing, and how would you go about writing that without being compared to Token?
Gosh.
In French.
Ooh. Well, I don't know. I can tell you that when I wrote classic Tolkien-esque fantasy, very close to the bone, many, many years ago, I was told, you are going to be ripped from stem to stern on this book, but you're also going to sell millions of it. Prophetic, I must say. And the point is that we always think that there's an end to something, but there's never an end to anything. There's just new forms, there's just new writers come along and decide that they could tell the story a little bit differently. And I don't think classic fantasy is done by any stretch of the imagination. I don't think Tolkien-esque fantasy is done by any stretch either. So I think
I mean,
it's just the next writer we're waiting on.
I mean, the fact is that there are always new readers coming of age. Everyone sees
Right.
something for the first time at some point. And in particular, that the Tolkien fantasy speaks to people, this sort of like farm boy, nothing to yeah, fantasy speaks to people. So no, I think it's around. It's been around for 4,000 years. I don't think we're gonna get rid of it in our lifetime.
Yeah.
I have a fantasy coming out next year with Delilah Dawson called Kill the Farm Boy. So where we basically are taking the Tolkien tropes and having a lot of fun with it. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. All right, last question.
I actually had pretty much the same question as she did, but instead I'll ask the second part of it. Who do you think are the kind of modern heroes of the classic fantasy, the ones who are who are doing it particularly well, I guess?
They're all up here.
Alex Marshall did a book called A Crown for Cold Silver, which I think is a wonderfully sort of twisted fantasy, but like it's different, but it's also the classic fantasy, and I love it. And not nearly enough people have read it, so that'd be my vote.
I think we see a lot of people who are actually working on their masterwork. I believe that when George R.R. Martin does complete Song of Ice and Fire, we're going to say this is a seminal work. This is a masterwork. I think Patrick Rothfuss is doing some wonderful things, and I am, for myself, content to wait for him to do it right the way he wants to do it, and the same is true for George Martin. So I think we have some real masterclass writers, and I would include Terry in that, who are have created this amazing body of work, and when we see it wrapped off and tied off, we're going to realize how amazing it is.
I talked about Scott Lynch too.
Oh, Scott. We just have to live long enough for.
I think that's very good enough.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you everybody for coming. It was great. Good questions.